Welcome back. I'm continuing my series on Matthean discourses and the question, did Matthew dischronologically create composite discourses? I'm answering no. You may recall from my earlier videos that I'm talking here about this idea that the Sermon on the Mount and some other discourses in Matthew, like what's called the commissioning discourse in Matthew 10, are places where Matthew knew that Jesus didn't say all these things at that time, but deliberately made it look like Jesus did say all these things on a single occasion, and in that sense created dischronological composite discourses. Now, as I've mentioned before, there was a time when I thought perhaps composite discourses on Matthew's part in these specific places could be achronological. But I changed my mind on that because of Matthew's very firm bracketing of them and D.A. Carson's discussion of that the firm bracketing really argue against an achronological interpretation in Matthew's case. Now, last time I talked about places where some of the material that is in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount is found somewhere else in Luke, sort of scattered. And this is often used as an argument that Matthew created composite discourses. But as I pointed out there, what happens in a lot of these places is that Luke appears to be achronological. Luke doesn't give a clear setting. And I'm not going to restate the examples that I gave there. Go back and look at the previous video if you want to see some examples of that. So today I'm going to talk about the question, Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, Sermon on the Plain in Luke. Are they the same or are they different? And how does this affect, how does this influence our conclusion about whether Matthew created dischronological composite discourses? Now, my attention was particularly drawn to this some years ago when I had a debate on the Unbelievable show with Craig Evans. Now, Evans used the difference in length between the Sermon on the Plain in Luke 6 and the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7 as an argument for Matthew's creating composite discourses. He then used the proposition that Matthew created composite discourses as an argument against John. And I discuss how that all goes. I discussed that in the previous video. But in particular, Evans focused on the fact that it's only about half a chapter in Luke 6 put on the same occasion, and then it's 3 chapters in Matthew. And his idea was, well, that must mean Matthew's like going elsewhere and finding material that Jesus didn't say on a given occasion, gathering it together, making it look like he said it on a given occasion. So what I had pictured at one point in the past, before I really delved into this for this video, was the idea that they were probably the same occasion, but that the common source, which might have been Q, which I have tentatively conjectured might have been Hebrew Matthew, like a shorter, earlier version of Matthew. The church fathers do allude to a Hebrew Matthew, might have been clearer about the fact that the content that's common to both sermons was uttered on the same occasion, but then there's some other content where the common source, which might have been Hebrew Matthew, was just less clear about what occasion it was uttered on, and that then when Matthew wrote his Greek gospel, he was more definite, made it clearer when this was uttered. Now, that wasn't a stupid conjecture, and it would explain the achronological placement of some of this material in Luke. But in doing this deep dive into the scholarship, I've really I've changed my mind, and I've come to a conclusion that yes, they are recounting the same occasion, but Luke has a source that's not Matthean. So either I'm wrong about Q, and Q was something else, it wasn't a Hebrew Matthew, or Luke just has access to something that's not Q, not Matthew, that's just independent, completely independent, and that may be true. Now, the content is placed in similar chronological context in both Gospels, and I think this is a good, decent argument that they really are meaning to indicate the same discourse. It's placed early in the ministry during one of Jesus' very popular Galilean preaching tours. It's placed just prior to his returning to Capernaum and healing the centurion's servant. And both of them also emphasize that even though there's a huge crowd there, he's in some ways preaching even more directly to his disciples. So it's like he's got a dual audience. Both settings in Luke and Matthew indicate that, which is kind of interesting. Here is one set of arguments that Luke has a non-Matthean source, an independent source. There's the different wording about where they took place. And later I'm going to be talking about why I don't think that's a contradiction. But just as far as wording is concerned, Luke does say that he came and stood on a level place. And Matthew refers to his going up on a mountain. So just in and of itself, that argues for some kind of independence, because they, even though I believe that they're easily harmonizable on that point, as I'll talk about later in this video, still, they're different, okay? Also, and more interestingly, the Sermon on the Level Place contains some sayings that are not found in Matthew at all. Now, that's kind of interesting. Now, that's not the majority of the content that's different in Luke. The majority of the content that's in some sense different in Luke is what I talked about last time. It's Luke placing things elsewhere that are found in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, his chronologically doing so. In some cases, I'll be talking about in other videos. I think Jesus did teach more than once in a similar way. But so in other words, Luke's is much shorter. And so for the most part, the material that's not common at that discourse point is material that's not found at that discourse point in Luke, but is in the 3 chapters in Matthew. But there are some exceptions to this, where Luke includes stuff in his shorter discourse that's not included in the longer discourse in Matthew. And in some cases, it's nowhere in Matthew at all. So that's not so simple to explain as just, Matthew had some stuff grouped in a Matthean queue, and then other stuff that sort of trailed off and was less clear about its placement in the Matthean queue, and then Luke makes it clearer in Matthew, in the Greek Matthew. It's not that simple, because the question is, where did Luke get this additional material that's not found in Matthew at all, and why did he place it so firmly within this discourse? By the way, Luke's Sermon on the Plain is also bracketed. At the end, he has kind of a wrap-up in the next chapter, 7:1, that really does make it look like this discourse is not composite on Luke's part either, this shorter discourse. And if Matthew wrote Q, and if Q is the only source that Luke has for this material, then and if Q makes it really clear that this material was at that point, then why didn't Luke include it in the Sermon on the Mount? So that is an argument that sometimes material that's called Q material comes from a source for Luke that wasn't written by Matthew, and that applies to these sermons. Now, in a sense, without quite thinking it through in those terms, I was already committed to the idea that Luke gets some material that's called Q material from a non-Matthean source, because of the case of, like, the centurion, for example, which contains those emissaries in Luke, and where it really looks like Matthew thought that the centurion came personally, even though that's considered Q material because, the story's found in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Still, it really looks like Matthew had some different source of information and that Luke had some different source of information. So once again, either I'm wrong to conjecture that Q itself was written by Matthew, or some material that's called Q material really isn't, and it, Matthew and Luke had just some outside source for it. Now, interestingly, D.A. Carson is very clear in advocating such partial independent possibilities as well. So this isn't just, Lydia doesn't have a clue and doesn't know the literature and she's making up these desperate expedients. In fact, something I've really enjoyed about reading portions of Carson's Matthew commentary is that he is absolutely not hindered by that rigid all or nothing dependence and independence assumption that I've highlighted for too many critical scholars, that, if this is based on Mark, then it's only based on Mark. Carson doesn't assume that. So in one place, for example, he's talking about Jairus, the healing of Jairus' daughter, and a chronological puzzle there, which I'm not discussing in this video today. But apropos of this, Carson says this rather obvious solution is invalid only if Matthew's and Luke's sole source of information in this pericope is Mark, but despite some critics, this is most unlikely. And so here I am standing up and cheering, even though the pericope is found in Mark and Luke and Matthew, and people think of Matthew and Luke as using Mark, it doesn't follow that Mark is all that they're using. Yay! All right, and then elsewhere, more generally, Carson says in some instances it is apparent that Matthew used not only Mark, but Q, however Q is conceived, probably other sources, and perhaps his own memory as well. Okay, so that Matthew's got access to various sources even for the same story. All right. Now here's just one example of material that's not found in the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew, but is found in the Sermon on the Plain or the level place or the plateau in Luke, which has led me to this idea that Luke has a source that is not Matthean for his sermon on the level place, which included, included some sayings that maybe Matthew just didn't remember that Jesus said on this occasion. So I'm going to read the context for both of these. First, Luke 6:37-38. Do not judge, and you will not be judged, and do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Pardon, and you will be pardoned. Give, and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. Okay, and by the way, the order is often quite different, but order would be one of the hardest things to remember. All right, so that's Luke 6:37-38. All right, now here's Matthew 7:1. This is in the Sermon on the Mount. Do not judge, so that you will not be judged, for in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. All right, so when I was studying for this video, I noticed that Matthew 7:1 applies the by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you, to judging others, so that if you're harsh or unfair or whatever in judging others, then that is likely to happen to you as well. That's what Matthew seems to be communicating. But that Luke, while putting the do not judge there as well, also puts in this about give and it'll be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaking together, running over, that you'll receive in proportion as you have given. And then Luke says, by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. So the measure comes up several times there. So the immediately preceding verse in Luke is unique to Luke and has to do with generosity. Okay. So I was, kind of puzzled about that. And I was thinking, well, that that about generosity and good measure pressed down, that's not anywhere in Matthew. Where did Luke get it from? And concluded that he got it probably from some non-Matthean source, someone else who remembered that Jesus said this on that occasion. But then that somewhat changes the application, the immediate application of by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return. However, in reading Carson's commentary, I learned, which I did not know before, that this saying about by the standard you use, your standard of measure, it will be measured to you in return, is found in the Talmud in a very different context, and therefore is proverbial. Carson notes it's a proverb. In the Talmud, it's found in this really grim Talmudic passage about the trial by ordeal of women accused of adultery, and then the punishment, sort of supernatural punishment that a woman who has committed adultery will obtain. And it's like, by the measure you measure, it will be measured unto you. It's very, you getting what you had coming, as it were. And so a really good parallel for that, by the measure you measure, it will be measured unto you, would be the contemporary idiom, what goes around comes around. Okay, just that common. Carson points out that Jesus seems to have used that proverb elsewhere in something that's completely separate from either Luke or Matthew or the Sermon on the Mount or anything, Mark 4:24-25, and he's talking about being careful what you hear and so forth. From him who has not will be taken even what he has, kind of a cryptic saying, and he does the by the measure you've measured will be measured to you again there. So Carson's point is it's a proverb, so Jesus can use it in a variety of contexts. And it's a very common theme of Jesus, even when these words are not used. What goes around comes around. For example, elsewhere, Jesus' parable of the unforgiving servant, which is like, if you do not forgive, you will not be forgiven. That's a theme, even though he doesn't use this proverb there. So it's very likely that Luke had independent knowledge that Jesus said this about giving and good measure in the sermon, and then that the what measure you measure, it will be measured to you again, applies to both kinds of things in this same sermon, both to forgiving, not judging harshly, okay, if you want to not be judged harshly, if you want to be forgiven. Notice that in Luke, pardon and you will be pardoned, okay, but that Jesus also applied it in this sermon to giving and it will be given to you, being generous. And those are all good illustrations of that concept, right? So really Luke is just inserting a saying, and by inserting, I don't mean that he had the Sermon on the Mount and inserted it, but what I'm just saying, he's including, maybe would be a better term, a saying in this same list of do this and it'll be done to you for bad or for good, giving and generosity and it coming back to you. All right. So I want to read a conclusion that Carson gives. It seems best then to take Matthew 5-7 and Luke 6:20-49 as separate reports of the same occasion, each dependent on some shared tradition, and then he has Q ? In parentheses, which is interesting, but not exclusively so. So this is exactly the same conclusion, that Luke has some information here that Matthew doesn't have, though Matthew has, in a sense, a lot more information that Luke doesn't have, which is what makes Matthew's sermon so much longer. The sermon is recorded by Matthew. And we'll be talking about more of that next time. Other places where, it's claimed that they're contradictory about when Jesus said something. Okay, but now that I've concluded that the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain are the same event, and Luke's is just shorter, though it has some additional material based on an independent source, we have to confront the question, is this a contradiction? Are there contradictions that mean that Luke and or Matthew is fictionalizing anyway? In other words, aside from the question of gathering, material and putting it into a dischronological composite discourse, is Matthew in some sense changing the setting or the time of this in a partial fictionalization move? Because after all, one of them says it was on a mountain and the other one says it was on a plain. Okay, now that's definitely been used to argue for that conclusion. And this is pretty common to argue for that conclusion in mainstream biblical scholarship. Recently, Dr. Michael Licona has used that directly, and he's talked about going to the place where maybe Jesus uttered the Sermon on the Mount and realizing that the acoustics are such that it's better to be below your audience rather than above your audience, sort of like we might have an amphitheatre or like a classroom where the teacher's standing below the students and then you've got seats that are up and around, and that's just better acoustics, which may well be true. But then Dr. Licona uses that as an argument that Matthew moved the geographical location up onto a mountain that means he was above the hearers, and that he did this in order to symbolize Jesus being the new Moses, Moses going up on the mountain to receive the law and so forth, so that he changed it. He changed the facts. And so that comes from this alleged contradiction between mountain and plain. All right, but a real interesting question is, does Matthew say anywhere, that Jesus was above his hearers, like that he was situated up high and talking with his hearers down? No. Matthew says he went up onto a mountain and the people came to him and he taught them and he said these things, but he does not say he went up onto a mountain and looked down and the people were down below him because he was on a slope and he was above all of his audience and he talked facing downward. I mean, there's nothing explicit to that effect, simply that he was up on a mountain. So this really overreading, which often happens with critical scholars. And also the plain in Luke gets overread. So here again is Carson on this mountain versus plain. Of the several solutions to mountain or plain, the most convincing one takes Matthew's on a mountainside to mean up in the hills, and Luke's plain as being some kind of plateau. And apropos of the plain, the word for plain, in Luke, he says this should not conjure up images of American prairie, but a relatively flat place in rough, rocky, or hilly terrain, perhaps plateau. And there were hills, above Capernaum. Capernaum itself is below sea level, but there are a lot of hills in Galilee. And he even points out that in Jeremiah 21:13, you can look it up in the you can look it up in your Bible, but also if we compare the Septuagint, the LXX as it's called, the same word is used for a plateau. Sometimes translated in Jeremiah 21:13, a rocky plateau. Okay, so very simple explanation here is that when Matthew says he went up the mountain, he's just talking about Jesus traveling upward into some hills. He's in a hilly area, okay? And then Luke says came down and stood on a level place. So he doesn't want to stand maybe even, above the people. So he comes down to just a place where there's a plateau and the people can be, if that is better acoustics, though I don't think we should be rigid about this, but many of them can be above him at that point. But he wants to be sitting or standing on a relatively flat place to talk. And I mean that there are lots of plateaus in the hills. So the whole symbolic interpretation, which by the way Carson also explicitly rejects, of just saying that Jesus is going up a mountain, oh, it's Moses, like that's way underdetermined, it's just unnecessary. And there's a very commonsensical, factual harmonization here, while nonetheless acknowledging that these differences in wording about the geographical setting indicate partially independent sources. All right, one more alleged contradiction. Now, the thing is, I don't want to be like Strauss here, David Strauss, if I ever could be. But okay, don't even want to get close to that. I've talked about this elsewhere where Strauss will insist that two incidents are the same, even though they look like they're different incidents, and then he uses the things that really make it pretty clear that they're different instances to argue that they're contradictory and therefore partially non-factual. It's this bizarre move that Strauss and unfortunately some of his followers today do. So, I don't want to say, okay, the Sermon on the Mountain and the Sermon on the Plateau are the same or part of the same event, occasion, and like, oh no, now I'm creating contradictions that don't need to be there. So I want to be careful about that. And that's why I've addressed the one about plain versus mountain. One other one I'm going to address here. This is the timing of it. Does the calling of the 12 disciples, specifically as the 12, qua 12, occur later in Matthew? Now, this is sometimes argued for by the fact that Matthew names the 12 later on. He gives his list of the names of the 12 in Matthew 10, 1 and 2. Matthew 10, 1 and 2 say, Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these. Gives the names of the 12. Now here's Luke right before the Sermon on the Level Place. He's pretty firm about here he's pretty firm about chronology. Luke isn't always, but here he is. Luke 6, 12 and following. It was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. Notice, by the way, that Luke is also talking about him being, in a mountainous region. And when day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles, gives a list of names. Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place. It's very much the scenario I'm picturing. He's trying to find a level place on which he and his 12 disciples will be standing. And there was a large crowd of his disciples and a great throng of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon. And turning his gaze toward his disciples, he began to say, ... And then you get the Sermon on the Level Place. So Luke's quite firm about connecting this as coming pretty much immediately after the designation of the 12 as a special group from within a larger group of disciples. But that's not really at all a contradiction. In fact, in my opinion, it doesn't even appear to be a contradiction, because Matthew doesn't say that the 12 were only chosen at the time he's describing in Matthew 10. Jesus gives them authority over unclean spirits and healing and so forth, because he's about to actually send them out without him. Okay? In groups of 2, in fact. And he's gonna, and so he's scattering them. He's not gonna be with them the whole time. Okay? So he's like commissioning them. So he's giving them very clearly these special powers. And when it says he summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority, that doesn't mean he's never designated them as the 12 before. In fact, you could even argue the contrary, that they've been this, special in-group already. And then he's like, okay, guys, now I'm going to be sending you guys out on a special mission, and I'm not going to be with you on that mission. And then Matthew realizes, he hasn't listed the names before, and he wants to list the names, so he lists the names. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these, but not, and this is when Jesus first designated them as the 12. So I don't think there's even the appearance of a contradiction there concerning the timing of the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. I think it's completely compatible with the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. Okay, so I know this is really nitty-gritty, but these nitty-gritty things are the kinds of things that get used over and over again in a bullying kind of way to say to laymen, you don't know what you're talking about. Scholars have spent a lot of time on this. Everybody knows in the scholarly community that Matthew created these composite discourses that he made look like they really took place at the one time, even though he knew they didn't. And that, Luke and Matthew have things placed at incompatible times and chronologies, and so they're just changing things and moving things, and you just got to shut up and accept it, basically. This is one of the reasons I'm emphasizing Carson so much here, also because I've learned a lot from his Matthew commentary about this question of composite discourses, but also because Carson cannot be and should not be co-opted to pretend that he agrees with those kinds of fact-changing literary devices. He emphatically does not. And I think it can also be spine-stiffening when you get that kind of bandwagon bullying, everybody who's a scholar thinks type of thing, and then the dismissal of me or someone who's been influenced by me on the grounds that, we don't have the proper credentials. So I really want to emphasize Carson for that reason as well. I find all of this interesting, though intricate. And so I hope you do too. Next time I'll be continuing to talk about composite discourses in the Sermon on the Mount, and especially talking about Jesus saying the same things on more than one occasion and why we should be really open to that. So please come back next time to the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.